Welcome back. This is Newsgang. So it's the year in review. The economy was definitely a big thing, but so was matters of governance and perhaps the war on corruption. As we've seen today in court, that taking another beating there. And don't forget, it is this year, right, that we saw the withdrawal of, at least 8 high-profile corruption cases, and then there was the whole thing about, was there pressure from, outside what are supposed to be independent constitutional officers. So, Wanjiru, what a year with that. We've seen some scandals. I think there was one that was nipped in the bud, like Linus was saying about, the procurement of mosquito nets. The treated mosquito nets. And then there is this one with the edible oils. So, it comes in, then we're told, first of all, it's hard to keep up with the tale around that one. So first we're told that the oil went missing, then that it was unfit for human consumption, and then that it was fit for human consumption. And, it's just...
There was also sugar, remember?
There was sugar as well, yes. Sugar that went missing. It's been a year, and there are some of these issues, but also the interesting thing is that, it's coming up as they're under investigation. It hasn't gone further in terms of us seeing, suspects and the bigger ones particularly being taken to court. I mean, everything is still under investigation now and people are still being questioned. But what a year it has been for governance. And we've talked about it from, the manner in which they run the economy. But, there's also in terms of how we're managing, tenders. And, we're now clearly a tenderpreneur country where everything, runs around that. And government is right at this heart and center of it.
Yeah, well, of course, governance, the corruption angle has been a long-standing issue. And we have a constitution, like we say, there's Chapter 6, there's Article 232 that binds public officers, and then we have elections that are also have a governance component. And the extent to which you don't sort out the elections governance, it spills over. And I don't think KK made any promises about corruption. Their manifesto was silent. They talked about a rules-based. They said, in fact, we had an engagement with the president when he was an aspirant, and we raised the issue of corruption. And he said, no, the fight against corruption has been weaponized and personalized. And so we are going to take a different approach. We're going to take an institution-wide approach to fighting corruption, and we're going to go for a rules-based approach. And we're like, what does that mean? What I think is happening is there's messaging that goes around appointments. There's messaging that goes around award of, state honors. There's messaging that goes around, former DPP, 8 cases are dropped, you're then given an even higher job in a very sensitive docket. That is how you set the tone. So the president has definitely set a tone that accountability is almost negotiable. And if you looked at it if you gave a lot of leeway, you would say that there seems to have been an amnesty granted. This government sat with itself and decided we are dropping corruption cases, but we are, if we're giving some leeway, we'd say we are drawing a line, no more corruption. So, we looked and said, well, those cases have been dropped. They've granted themselves an amnesty because those guys have then been appointed in office. What's going to happen? So when we see corruption cases coming up, and we see other cases continuing to fall, really we are looking at the worst case scenario, and there are scenarios that have been generated by 2 institutions that are very good scenarios to look at. And one of them looks at really a situation where the institutions of Kenya fall captive to, get criminalized. Because it's one thing to have criminality and institutions check it, but it's another when you have institutions getting criminalized. So we seem to be, if we're not careful, that's the direction we're going in. Wrong people in public office with power, turning a blind eye or doing the wrong thing makes it difficult for people to do the right thing. But as Lina said, we have a constitution that's very strong. And kudos to the judge who made this very clear ruling on Aro Kimwarer and really has put that case out in the public. And I think the reality is we need to recognize that we have to change the way we are engaging as civil society. And when I say civil society, I mean the wider civil society, the media, the religious institutions, academic institutions, NGOs, because we have a government that's working differently. And we could decide to sit and watch, or we could decide to engage. So for me, I feel when the DPP dropped those 8 cases, we needed to have had a very public process interrogating what happened. We now have a...
Led by who?
The public. Our constitution is a product of a civil society-led process where you had, these were lawyers, people in academia, if you look at the 90s, moving on, and eventually politicians joined on, but it was a citizen-led moment. So we need to recognize we are losing our country and we are losing our institutions. And if the economic failures of this administration don't fell it, and even if the economy was to somehow turn around, we will have lost our institutions because integrity, people of integrity actually are likely to be on the firing end of this government, as we've seen with the control of budget. As Bilo was explaining the role of control of budget, then it becomes even more, what's happening to Dr. Nyakongo then actually now falls into clearer light. Parliament doesn't want to be checked. Government doesn't want to be checked. They want somebody who's compliant enough to let these supplementary budgets go through, allow us to do what we are doing.
But is the public interested in checks and balances as well? Because when you speak, for example, on the public auditing or looking at the 8 cases and all that, take a very simple example. The EACC gives a list of 241 people that are unfit for office just before the election of 2022. What happens? The majority of those are elected. So haven't politicians really figured out the public that it's a public that is not really interested in accountability that much, and maybe accountability is just a preserve of a small table like the news gang?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But of course, that list, the EACC list, needed to have informed. There are many steps because there's also the IEBC that didn't make, there was the EACC, can you make the decision? There were some regulations that IEBC was to have enacted that the court stopped. Then the IEBC didn't make the decision to stop those guys and they got onto the ballot. And then there's the political parties also who maybe would have had the option. So there are many stops before the public, but like you say, we have an accountability deficit. There's a step we missed in our constitution, making our state building. And I think around, the Agenda 4, 208, 209 conversation, there's conversations that we didn't conclude, whether it's the TJRC, whether it's the issue of land. I believe even the post-election violence issues, don't be vague, go to Hague. We missed an opportunity to discuss what kind of people are we, who around after elections can pick machetes and kill. So because we haven't owned our misbehaviors, we are still stuck in that miasma of misbehavior. But the point is, you can't run a government or an institution based on poor governance and corruption.
You see, the question you asked about the public is a question we have tried to deal with when we were drafting this constitution in Bomas. I was dealing with one of the chairman of one of the technical committees dealing with the chapter on integrity, chapter 6. And we wanted to include specific provision in that chapter that would give IEBC the powers to bar anyone who has been implicated in corruption from running for an office. But I think the argument that was put is that, look, the world over, the public acts as a screen. The public, the election process itself is a screening process. The public should be the ones to say, no, you are not fit to hold office because you are not a person of integrity. But the challenge is that our public has, the gullibility of our public is as a function of the political manipulation that we have seen. You know, public has been, people give excuses, you know, they're poor, people are given money. But the reality is that politicians in this country, others have learned how to manipulate the public, and therefore they can get re-elected because of that. But it's not that people don't know, they know that you're not a good person, but people have learned a way. Politicians have been given the, you know, they found a way of exploiting you so that you can vote. But the fact remains, corruption cannot be won in courts. I think the war on corruption is a political war. It requires the political will of the leader. When you say there's zero tolerance, you start off from the day you are sworn in office. Don't appoint someone who has been implicated. If someone has been, if there is a smoking gun, that's evidence enough for you, fire the person. But the moment you say you're going to fight corruption in a court of law, you're not going to win. With the way our criminal justice system works, and the lawyers and and all that, is not going to be an easy vote that you can win. I've seen countries where, in Europe, for example, country like Sweden, no one gets charged for corruption. The fact that you have been implicated and publicly forced to resign, that embarrassment is enough punishment. They deem that is enough punishment for you, and you don't even need to be taken to court. You are fired and you don't get any further job in public service again. You can't. But here you are today, this government fires you, the other one appoints you. This government charges you, after 3 months you're back in office. The closest we have come to the executive giving that hint of goodwill. Kibaki, when he fired when 4 or 5 ministers had to step aside, you remember Angololi Singh? Uhuru, when he submitted the 175 names to Parliament, and asked all those 175 guys to step aside. It kind of created some excitement. Said these guys are serious. But what you need to do as the leader, political will is the most important thing if you want to fight corruption. All these things that you hear about, cases being withdrawn, they cannot be done without the consent of the guy at the top. You can't. You will get in trouble, even as whoever you are along the criminal justice system. You must. So I think you need to be very clear and say, look, if I am fighting, in fact, the day the president was at Jamhuri Day celebration this week, at the Uhuru Gardens, what was the headline in the newspapers? The country in darkness. The country in darkness. And then, the pictures they put there was dark. You would have thought then, some fellows will lose their jobs, because what is accountability? It's not just about stealing money. It's failing to carry out your mandate. Why would an airport go into darkness? Why would a country be in darkness every month? So we'd expect somebody to be told to step aside, or someone to be fired. But nothing happens. So
something happened. There's a big procurement that's going to happen around that. We'll never have power outages anymore somehow. But just saying this, we've been talking about this for a long time and talking about political will that's not forthcoming. There's three forces that make the state. There's the political force or the government, there's the private sector, and then there's the civil society. I think in our approach, we come from a centrist background. We're used to big government, and we always look at government. We've been expecting government to sort this problem for us. And they're not going to sort it. Actually, things are getting worse. So it's high time we just say that, okay, we have the Constitution, great, but we now need to deal with the software, the national ethos, and government is not going to do it for us. And it's going to be the wider civil society. It has to be the people. If it's not the people, it will be a crisis, because this will run us into a crisis that will force some action. And if it doesn't, then we'll become a criminal state. We have countries where people are routinely kidnapped. Of course, we've been hearing instances of high-profile kidnappings, which are very alarming. And, that will become the norm. So I think we need to recognize we are getting into very, very, very murky water. And it's not going to be the political class that sorts us out. And maybe just the last point on this, when we're talking about Parliament and parliamentary oversight, Parliament are interested mostly in the CDF. Even when they're talking about, the economic situation we are in, and all said and done, their big argument is, where's the CDF?
Yeah.
And this is a matter that's in court. So there's a perverse incentive by Parliament around the budget because they have a stake in CDF. So oversight then becomes negotiated. Give us CDF and you will pass your supplementary budget or whatever. So the political class will not save this country. And I think this country needs saving. That's my take. We've got the economic problem that hopefully we can sort out, but we have a larger governance problem that is going to be with us for a long time. And that's what we really should be thinking about. How do we deal with this?
And Yvonne, I'm wondering about, because I look at a statement that was shared by the former Director of Public Prosecutions about Arol and Kimarel Dams issue. And he said that time, I have also noted the shocking magnitude of the amounts involved and the range of parties that are of interest to the investigations. This has in turn made investigations complex, requiring investigators to cover a wide range of areas, including but not limited to a thorough analysis of many things that he highlights in the tendering process and procurement. But then again, at the same time, that time, remember, he was talking about some 21 billion shillings that had already been paid. Mm-hmm. The deputy president then, who is the president today, was talking about the money in question is 7 billion shillings.
Yes, I remember that, yeah.
Thereafter, the then president...
Just 7 billion.
Yeah, he said it was only 7 billion.
Only 7 billion.
Yeah.
End of quote. Shortly after, the president then, Uhuru Kenyatta, appointed a technical committee to look at the two projects. Mm-hmm. And in fact, returned that one of the projects was not viable and therefore was supposed to be abandoned. But he said there's one project, I think it was, let me just find it which one it was, Arol Dam. Yeah. It was to be reduced in height from 96 meters to 60 meters. It was to reduce the acreage to 250 acres. And the cost was supposed to be reduced from 28.3 billion shillings to 15.4 billion shillings. But the interesting bit is that this issue became political. The then deputy president was talking about it was cancelled to fight him.
To fight him, yeah.
And in fact, very early this year, in a meeting with the president of Italy, they agreed that they were going to withdraw all cases against Italian firms. Yeah. And of course, the Italian firms are going to withdraw cases against the Kenyan government. And in fact, if you have to follow and to revive the projects, exactly, the trajectory of what has been about this, so many cases are withdrawn, or charges against people, including the current Central Bank of Kenya governor and the current deputy governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Susan Koech. The cases against the firms were actually dropped. And what has happened today? The final case has collapsed.
That's it.
Remember, there was a promise that this is going to be built. It has taken 8 months. I'm just wondering, Kero, if you can help us here. Even as you call for accountability, and Wanjiru advocates that the members of the public have a stake here because the Constitution allows them to do so, how do you do that accountability? Because the former DPP received a lot of files, not just about this, received a lot of files to prosecute certain people from the EACC. Those files are still pending against governors, against cabinet secretaries, but today he occupies a different office. What accountability can you pursue there when such an officer has the blessings of the president?
Very little. Let me tell you, what Gikonya doesn't tell you is that this is a representative democracy. People have to, the public elected people, and they exercise their, sovereign mandate through the elected representatives. What they can do as members of parliament is through the civil society, as she said, through the media and through other forums. But in terms of actually the people who have been elected by the people to represent them and to do that oversight, that accountability you're asking now, the right office, the back of the parliament. They can summon that former DPP, they can call the current DPP and demand, how did this case fall? How much did the government waste chasing this case? How much money has been wasted, public service time and so forth? But as well as I do, that it's not going to happen for the obvious reasons that we know that the parliament is now it's become an appendage of the executive. But that accountability is not going to be there today because of that. There's no parliament. Two, if the executive as you've mentioned earlier, in March announced that these cases will be withdrawn, then there is no likelihood of anyone trying to investigate that matter or follow out that matter. Even the officer, she said Attorney General, the judge said Attorney General, and so forth. The Council for Administrative Justice, they were not going to open that file for obvious reasons, that they know that the instructions that have come in from probably the presidency, and so they're not going to get involved in it. But so the sad thing, however, is that when our leaders speak, they talk about we have not lost money. The issue is not about losing money. Is that the criminality is for breach of law. If there is any breach of law in a process of procurement or any process of government, that is an offense, and that's what you get charged for, and that's what you get dismissed for. It's not about money lost. And so clearly, I think for me, that's not even my worry. My worry is now many other government officers today who are holding those offices will look at this thing and say, look, if you work with the boss, you'll get away with these things. So it has an effect, a negative effect on accountability. Those who are in criminal justice system will feel, it's not worth sometimes investigating these things. Ultimately, these things will be decided by, people outside, the courts. So I think the messaging is you cannot go on a national day and say, my government is committed to fighting corruption. No shilling will be lost on your housing fund. No shilling will be lost on this. But at the same time, your government is getting people out of court, getting out of jail. Clearly, in what the judge was very clear, that the DPP was getting instructions. So I think it's unfortunate. But for me, as a businessman, the thing I look at, Sam.
Really, what if DPP stood firm? And the Constitution is a very beautiful document.
Yeah.
It gives them institutional independence, security of tenure, and all those things.
Correct.
If we've got somebody who will stand firm and say, this is how this institution is supposed to run, don't you think that will make a difference?
Of course.
Because right now, for example, we have judges that are making a big difference in this country by just saying something as courageous as that position of CIS is not in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Or
the BBI one, you remember?
Or the BBI one. And should we dread the day that they too start losing that courage and say, no, anyway, everybody's doing these things this way? And I got a bit of that, especially in my interpretation of the Finance Act judgment the other day on housing levy, and where they say, okay, it's unconstitutional, but you can continue for another 45 days. I see that fear starting to come to the bench as well. So don't you think really it comes down to the quality of the individuals that people, these officers?
Of course. Anything to do with checks and balances is always about the individual who holds those. That's why they're called independent offices. They have been given that mandate. Because of that, to be able to get a right person who can stand up and say no. That is the checks and balances this Constitution provides. And the entire, Constitution, all those commissions and independent offices, by the way, their budget is negligible. But the important thing is that they are supposed to say no. But it is all about individuals, and individuals are individuals, and particularly when some of these things are accompanied by intimidation. Telephone calls that Konyo talks about, which is there, it's a fact. Or you get transferred. You saw what happened to some judges when those rulings of the CIS and things, several of those people were moved. What happened to the judges in the BBI? Their promotions or whatever appointments were put on ice. When intimidation comes in, then some people obviously would think twice that is it worth it? But I think if you look at the bigger picture, we have a nation, a country. If it is you where the buck stops, I think it's important that you must exercise that independence. Otherwise, you should leave that office. It doesn't make sense that you hold an independent office, but you don't act. Particularly DPP, we created it deliberately because of that. This thing used to be done in the days of Chunga. It was the police.
Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah.
It was the police. Now you are
the way it's being done now.
Yeah, it was done the way it was being done now, and we were moving away from that. And this independent office, you have been given resources. You can do whatever you want. You know, and so it's really unfortunate if these institutions let down Kenyans, especially on the. But otherwise, accountability, you cannot say you rely on the goodwill of an executive. You know that they were going to do things right. No, it doesn't happen anywhere in the world. You need those institutions.
Yeah, that's right. But you get the final word, Wanjiru. So
okay,
let's wrap this up.
Oh, final word. All right, I was going to make another point.
No, make the point.
Yes,
and, you know, as you wrap
yeah. No, I was going to kind of maybe not quite agree with Bilo to say, yes, officers should take a courageous stand, like the magistrate in this case. That's amazing. But, you know, you need an environment in which to take a stand. The average person will go with the flow. The average person will be careful. And that's not necessarily because they're a bad person. So leadership matters. And the point I'm making here is we have an accountability crisis. We have a leader. The tone being set is undermining rule of law, the Constitution. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Henry Rotich then gets an appointment, because it seems the bigger corruption scandal you've been associated with, the more likely you are. Back to Treasury, maybe? Maybe, just to complete, you know, the important Aurora Kimurere project that is now moving on. So the messaging really is about patronage. In fact, the term is a neo-patrimonial state. It's a state where decisions are made politically. And you have a formal, we had capture before. Now you have a formal budget process, formal policy process, you talk to each other, blah, 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 but the deals are being made by the powers that be. So we are losing our institutions, and we've got some brave public officers who are standing firm, but if the onslaught continues, not that many will withstand. And I will say it again, we have to change how we are engaging. We have to read the sign of the times that we are losing our country, we are losing our constitution. There's a proposal to amend the constitution. And, you know, there's many steps in that. One, the courts could stop the process again. The people could then reject whichever amendments are coming up. But it's the political class driving these amendments. So we are really at risk of losing the gains of our democracy and accountability. And that, to me, is where we need to really prime ourselves and realize, much as we are suffering under the yoke of a very difficult economic times, we are also suffering the yoke of losing the character and the moral foundation of our country through the actions that we are seeing.
But Wanjiru, I hope you agree that blame actually goes both ways, both the political elite and the public as well.
I agree. And what I'm thinking about is maybe we need to start focusing on solutions and have a discussion about what do we do. Because there's still mechanisms. You know, with court rulings or the kind of decision that took place, if the AG doesn't do anything, there's also the East African Court, there's also international courts. But there's the Court of Public Opinion. Yeah. And the masters of the Court of Public Opinion are the public. And we haven't exercised that power in a long time. The last time that power was exercised was around the Constitution, and that was maybe more of a middle-class project. It wasn't a proper citizen project. So maybe it's time to go back to that level of dialogue and say, is this the country we want? Are Kenyans really happy with what they're seeing? I think not.
But to give credit to Kenyans, they have, particularly in dealing with members of parliament, if you look at the turnover in parliament, 70–80% sometimes getting replaced.
Agreed.
Because of that accountability. Even when we saw what happened in the last election, the president's, you know, campaign platform was rejected. People who were looking at Kenyans were looking at different, you know. So Kenyans, I think, try their best as public sometimes to stand up and say, no, we don't want this. And they do, they exercise that power at the ballot. Yeah. But I think what Wanjiru is saying, that probably it's time we not wait for the 5 years, but try and, you know, convert more. I sometimes think even some of these things we are saying, it helps, by the way. You know, you might think it's not, but they do listen, even if they don't take 100%, but it prevents a wider or a deeper problem from the concerns Kenyans are expressing every day in the media, and you know, it helps. And I think this freedom itself over 60 years, one of the main things we have achieved is this opportunity to tell them what you are doing is wrong. And I think it helps at least. Otherwise, the situation would be worse.
Yeah,
And
that's
can
right.
I just say Esther Tarus,
Yes.
this young student, I think that was
Yes,
her
yes.
name,
Yes, yes.
who challenged
right.
the governor
Yeah.
around the Finland issue. I see they've gone to small claims court.
Yes.
And, you know, it's really sad that that's the route they've had to take, because you'd have expected, you know, if there was proper social sanction, action should have taken place immediately. But the courage of those students shows us that Kenyans are tired and Kenyans are ready to speak to power. So I think things are changing. I saw also around the case, the exam results,
Yes.
parents
Yes.
speaking, and you know, those are, I think, average parents who normally would not want to be in the limelight, and they're speaking.
Yeah.
So things are changing, and Kenyans, I think, are ready. And I think it's time we get back into a national dialogue and say, these politicians are giving us a headache. We haven't managed this problem. How do we fix ourselves and fix them?
Yeah, indeed. And maybe that's where we take it to next year. And there is hope. I want to thank you for spending this last show with us and for giving us your thoughts. And, you know, there is hope. We see what happens next year. Thank you, gang, for this year. Next year is another year when we'll be back as well in full swing. It's been a year.
17 days away.
Yes, because you're making it sound like it's New Year's Eve.
Bring out the champagne.
Well, yeah, I know we should have brought out the champagne and popped it. Yeah, look, thanks everyone, and thanks for the show. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your feedback throughout the year. You will still see us here because the work must continue. Just maybe not here on The Gang, but we'll definitely be back in 17 days' time, as I am reminded. Thanks for watching the show.